Oh, you're going to be doing a poetry workshop. You know what? That would have been the very, very last thing you could have got me to do when I was at school. I think it's because poetry was presented to us as Shakespeare and Byron and Tennyson and Shelley, all these old kind of aristocratic names, and I couldn't relate to any of it. And the language was pretty dull as far as I was concerned. And it took one teacher at one point who kind of made me get it. She did it through music, made me realize that music was poetry with a melody and a beat on top of it. But she also made me realize what a useful way it was of expressing all the weird stuff that was going on inside me. All the kind of growing up stuff that I couldn't really talk to anybody else about and that I didn't really have the words for. And then I suddenly got it. So that's what we're going to be doing, trying to make poetry a little bit more relevant to all of you guys. And what a time to do it. Because the workshop we're going to be doing is going to be around some of the events that, if you live in Bristol at least, you would be aware of. Now, the protests that happened last week about racial equality and people's rights and people feeling like the system wasn't working for them, those protests have a long, long history. And although we're going to be focusing on the Windrush, I want to kind of put you in mind as to what that history was before we begin. So you've got that in your minds before we start writing some poetry. Now, 400 or 500 years ago, slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, began. And millions of people who had made their home in Africa for thousands of years were transported on ships to go and work for free under really terrible conditions in the Caribbean, in South America, in North America, and a few of them even here and in the rest of Europe. Now, all of those people obviously had a pretty horrible life, but they settled. Slavery ended, and they tried to make do. Now, if you skip a few hundred years, try and just do that in your mind, skip through all the history, skip through Tennyson and Byron, all of those people, skip through America gaining independence, and you suddenly end up in 1939, the Second World War. Now, the Second World War, you've got Hitler and Mussolini on one side, you've got Churchill in America and the French on the other side, fighting it out, this fight between fascism and liberalism. Now, the Germans could only call on the Germans and whoever else they'd conquered to fight for them. However, the British could call on their vast, vast empire for men and women to come and fight and work alongside British people in the fight for what they termed as freedom. The Second World War comes to an end. What happens? All of these people go back to their Caribbean islands, to their North American homes, and for some of them, especially those in places like Jamaica, they felt abandoned. They'd gone and fought, and what for? Their lives were still probably as horrible, if not worse, than they were before the war. But at some point in 1948, an advert turns up. And it's saying you can get a really cheap ferry. Imagine that, a holiday, all the way across the Atlantic. There'll be good jobs, it said. You can make yourself new, you can make yourself a new life over there. And so people took it up. Some wanted to go for a few weeks. Some wanted to go for a few years. Very few actually imagined that they were going to stay here forever and ever, and that their children and their grandchildren were going to stay here forever and ever. But, as it turned out, that's what happened. So on the 22nd of June, 1948, HMT Empire Windrush arrived on the shores of Great Britain. And a few hundred men and some women arrived in England to make their new lives. They spent the first 4 weeks at Clapham South Deep Shelter, which had been an air raid shelter during the war. And then after that, they had to make their way, find a job, find a home, and all of that. In our workshop, I want you to think a little bit about the emotions that would have been going through their minds, through their hearts. What does it mean to migrate to a place far away? What does it mean to live in a place that has a totally different culture to yours? I want us to think about the hopes that these people had, and the fears, the memories that they would have had of home. What would they have made of the food, of the weather? And what would they have made of the promise that had been made to them in those newspaper ads saying that life would be good, when in fact they arrived often to really cramped conditions in tiny little flats or rooms in London? But eventually, some of them found jobs, some of them got more of an education, and they made their lives for them. The grandchildren and children, and even some of the originals, are living in Bristol today. And every 22nd of June, they celebrate this moment and remember that first landing of HMS Empire Windrush, when suddenly Britain and this British island's population began to be called multicultural. I'm really looking forward to us talking about your own emotions, what you feel about poetry. Where have you encountered things that have made you really feel like that is the only way that could have really hit my heart? Maybe it was a song, maybe it was a film, but I want us to think about how we can turn the experience of others, meld them up with all of our own emotions, and come out with a piece of art. I think in every single one of you, in every single person that I've ever met, there's an artist that's dying to just jump out. But school isn't always the best place for that artist to jump out. Home isn't. When we're with our friends, it always isn't. Maybe we feel embarrassed. So hopefully you can strip away some of that embarrassment. Maybe you can strip away some of those weird emotions about, should I really say what I want to say? And make some really amazing, beautiful poetry together. I'm really, really looking forward to meeting all of you on this coming week, and hopefully we make something beautiful together. See you soon.